begin if my voice gives out. I'm the last of my family to get the crud through our house. So I will do my best. Since it is Easter, let us begin by saying, Alleluia, Christ is risen.
Alleluia, Christ is risen.
So, what's the big deal? How has Christ's rising transformed our lives? Today, as I mentioned to the girls, we hear this story that is often told as the story of doubting Thomas. But I think that's just a really unfair characterization. If we read the gospel lesson a little bit closer, we see that when Jesus appears to the disciples who were there the first time, he shows them his wounds. You know? It's not just some sort of bodiless voice, showing up in the room saying, guys, Jesus is alive. Like, Jesus gives those 10 disciples a very concrete witness of his resurrection. So we could call him like Thomas, the seeker of parity. We could just say Thomas, the guy who wants the same thing that everybody else got, and that seems kind of reasonable, but that's a much longer title. But I don't want to think of him as doubting Thomas. And if we are going to think of him as doubting Thomas, I don't think it's fair to think of him as doubting Jesus. I think one thing that perhaps he could have been doubting was the word of the disciples because of their own actions, or perhaps inactions, right? Jesus says to them, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. This kind of implies to me some sort of engagement with the world, right? Because you're not going to be doing much forgiving or retaining if you're not actually interacting with anybody. There's not a lot of work to be done if you just sit in your locked room by yourselves. I mean, maybe one of you, when you get up to get a glass of water, you're going to stub your toe, say something inappropriate, and then your friends can say, oh, it's okay, we forgive you. But there's not a lot of forgiving or retaining to be done if you aren't going into the world. If Jesus has sent them, presumably outside that room where they're locked for fear of society. So, why wouldn't Thomas say, I'd like to see a little bit more than just your word, because whatever happened with you guys when I wasn't there, I don't know where he was. He was out getting, soda or something. But he wasn't there, and this thing happened to them, and it didn't really seem to have much of an effect on their lives, because 8 days later they were still in the room, hiding. They were still scared. And I feel like in this story, we can really, maybe, if we're honest with ourselves, identify with that. I feel like we often, as the church, we come here and we say, Hallelujah, Christ is risen, and we mean it. I think we mean it. But I think when we go back out of this building, when we don't lock the door, but when we open the doors back up and we go out into the world, our hallelujahs sometimes get a little bit quieter, right? Because we don't want to get teased, maybe, or we don't want to cause a fuss at our job, or whatever it is. Our faith gets a little bit quieter when we leave church. Now I, of course, have sort of a professional obligation to be a little bit louder about my faith. And I do a lot of public ministry, as you know, and I do a lot of interfaith work, and I do a lot of things where I interact with unchurched people who are passionate about the same things that God has called us to be passionate about, but for non-religious reasons. And this is what I hear from these people. I hear something akin to what Thomas is saying to his friends. When I, or Carmine, or other of our colleagues talk to our co-workers in the social justice work that we do, we hear them say, "Oh, I had no idea that Christians cared about poverty, or immigration, or the environment, or, name it, things that are very clear in the Bible that we are called to care about. But when we leave this place and, when we leave our little safe locked room with our comrades and then we go out into the world for fear of society, we get a little bit quieter about it. When people hear me or Carmine or some of our colleagues talk with passion and fire about the call that Jesus has given us to care for others, to stand up for others, people say, "I didn't know that Christians talked like that. I've never heard that before." When we talk about the things that root our work in our faith life, people say, "I didn't know that that's what Christians believed." So when the disciples come to Thomas and they're like, "We've seen Jesus, but that's pretty much where it ends." And Thomas is like, "I'm going to need a little bit more." We really shouldn't be that surprised. And we really shouldn't be pinning all of the responsibility on Thomas, right? He wasn't there. How many people, in some way or another, haven't been there? Haven't been in a place where they have seen Jesus in some way. There are plenty of people out there who just, for whatever reason, haven't been in that situation. But then how do those 10 disciples, how do we, who have had those encounters with Jesus, how do we bring that news in a way that is believable? Do we bring that news in a way that is believable? I think that we sometimes fall short. I think that we historically have fallen short. I think that the church, throughout the years, for fear of offending, for fear of making waves, for fear of losing members, for fear of losing money, for fear of all sorts of things, but never for fear of not proclaiming the gospel. It's always for fear of human things, for fear of temporal things, for fear of bodily or social suffering. I think that the church, for too long, has stayed locked in our room, seeing Jesus, getting really excited about him, and then getting really quiet about it when we leave this safe place and when we leave this safe community where we know that we are all on the same page and it's easy to talk to each other about Jesus. And then we go out and we see Thomas. Who's Thomas to us? Maybe people who used to come to church but haven't been here in a while. People in our families who, were baptized at some point and never went to church after that. People that we interact with on a daily basis who just don't know that Christians actually care about people like them. When we encounter those Thomases in our lives, we say, "Oh, you doubting Thomas, what's wrong with you?" Or do we take that opportunity to hold up a mirror to ourselves and say, "How am I not bearing Christ into the world? he needs, Jesus gives it to him. Jesus doesn't say, "Oh, you doubter. Why do you want to see my hands? Huh? Come on, I showed it to the other guys, and they told you, and that should be it." No. Jesus just says, "Hi, Thomas. Here I am." Jesus just loves Thomas, offers him the same peace he offered the other 10. Jesus gives him exactly what he needs. And Jesus does the same for us. Even when we fall short, like the disciples perhaps did, even when we don't do exactly what we are called to do, even when we stay quiet at times when we know that it might be scary to speak up, but that God is calling us to speak up. Even then, when we ask Jesus for what we need, Jesus still shows up even for us. Every week, or as often as you come, on Sundays, we gather around this table and we ask Jesus for what we need. And what happens? He gives it to us. Jesus shows up. Every week, we come back and we ask for what we need, and Jesus shows up. In the bread and wine that become his body and his blood. We see his body, his wounded, broken body in the pieces of bread. We see the blood coming out of his wounds. I'm sorry, it's kind of gross, but that's what we see. Pouring out of the wounds on his hand and his side in the wine that we drink. When we ask Jesus for what we need, when we say, "Jesus, we just kind of need to see you right now," we get Jesus. And when we go out into the world and encounter people who are asking the same question, when we find people who are like Thomas saying, "I think I just need a little bit more. I think I just need to see Jesus a little bit more." When we encounter those people, Jesus can show up in us. Jesus can show up in the ways that we are called to serve others. And I think that's kind of amazing. Even when we fall short, even when we are scared, even when we don't do as much as perhaps we feel called to do, even when we compromise a little bit so that our lives are a little bit easier in society, Jesus, when we ask, will come for us. So this isn't the story of a doubting Thomas who should have known better, who should have been a better disciple, who should have been able to see without believe without seeing. This is the story of all of us on both sides. This is the story of those of us who come every week or as often as you come. Every time that we come here, we see Jesus and have the opportunity to go out and tell others about it. And this is the story about all of us who sometimes we hear about Jesus, but we need a little bit more. And we can find comfort in the knowledge that even in a situation where Jesus was appearing physically to people, which doesn't really happen that much anymore, and often if we hear stories about that, we start looking at the DSM. But even when Jesus was so freshly resurrected, before he ascended, before, all of history began, the history of the church, even then, face to face, even when they could feel his breath on them, Jesus himself didn't chide Thomas, didn't criticize him, didn't call him a doubter. Jesus loved him and gave him peace and gave him what he needed. And that is the Jesus that we come to worship. And that is the Jesus that we come to receive in communion. And that is the Jesus that drives us this Easter season to say, Alleluia, Christ is risen. Amen.